Welcome to LookAhead Radio with Tom Arms and Lockwood Phillips.
As the evening begins, we have a lot to talk about with Tom Arms. We're going to probably move around on the proposed schedule because so much of what's happened in the past few days here in the States, and be interested in getting Tom's observations about that. And again, these are not only Tom's observations, this is what he sees and hears reading the media there from his office in London, England. And with that, Tom, good evening. Thank you for joining us.
Good evening.
And
always a pleasure.
And the question, I saw that you are experiencing some very, humid and cold weather, but also significant amounts of fog. So tell us what the weather's like there in your home.
Freezing fog, you're right. It hasn't been too bad today, but early in the week we had severe freezing fog. It was a bit humid, and of course the freezing weather just pushed it right down to ground level. For 2 days, I think all the flights at Heathrow, Gatwick were closed.
Wow.
Cancelled.
So it was...
or at least in the morning.
Okay.
As soon as it warmed up during the day, the fog would dispel, and it was much nicer. But it was really quite thick.
And there's some question, was it smog and fog or just fog?
No, just fog.
Okay.
Just fog. They haven't had smog in London, not serious smog, since 1955.
Okay, because that has been a topic of discussion in years past. All right, let's move on to the issues of the day. Now, this is not on our list. We're going to get to the issue of Brexit, but the events over the past couple of days since President Obama left and President Trump took office, the question first has to do with what was the observations of both the inauguration and the day following the various protests. I know that there were protests in London, but let's start with the inauguration speech. What were the opinions?
They thought it was very aggressive. Various people were saying it was one of the worst inaugural addresses they'd ever heard. That it was much too aggressive, that the role of the president is not to divide the country, but to unite the country, and to be president not for the people who elected him, but for all the people, whether they voted for him or not.
Now,
and basically the feeling was that, he was going to be president for the people who voted for him, but he was going to stick his finger up to those who didn't.
The other aspect of that, he did talk about issues that he thought needed correcting. Let's talk about the response there, though, in Europe, particularly regarding his comments about America first and making America great again. How was that received?
I think, they've got no problem with America first, as long as it's not America first at the expense of other people, i.e. a beggar your neighbor policy. Mm-hmm. And in particular, they're worried about EU. Just today, I was listening to Ted Malloch, who is Trump's ambassador designate to the EU. And he's saying basically that Trump doesn't like the EU, that he is going to do his best to oppose the EU, that he is against supranational organizations and would rather it wasn't there, and that he hopes that the EU or expects the EU, or at least the Euro, to collapse within 18 months. Well, if you go around saying things like that, the world's greatest power saying, I don't like the EU and the Euro should collapse, then you risk the self-fulfilling prophecy.
Let's talk about the day following the, of course, march in Washington and the, if you wish, the tangential story about the number of attendees, both at the inauguration and at the march in Washington. But also there were protests around the world. There was a protest in London, was there not, on Saturday?
There was a big protest in London. I think it was about 200,000.
And what were they?
Please, I don't want to get in an argument with someone about figures. That's what I read.
I don't want to. I agree with you. But my question is, what were they protesting in London, just out of curiosity?
I think it was much the same as protest in Washington. There was a whole range of things. There was women's rights, the issue of abortion, the issue of immigration, the issue of racism. It was a rainbow of protest. Basically, they don't like any of Trump's policies. Now, you have to remember, as I've tried to stress time and time again, the United States is the most powerful, influential country in the world. So when the President of the United States introduces domestic policies in the United States, which are seen as being, if we like, racist or anti-feminist or anything like that, or anti-immigration, then it's going to have a knock-on effect. It's going to affect the policies of other governments right around the world. Okay. America is the world leader. It sets an example.
Related to racial issues, you've got bad race relations in other countries of the world. Are they focused purely on the United States? The issue of misogyny and the events in the Middle East, is this seen as only a U.S. problem, or is it seen as a problem?
No, of course not. Okay. It's a world problem. What I'm saying is the people who were protesting did not think that the solution to the problem was policies similar to the ones being introduced by Donald Trump. Trump is setting the example for other governments to follow.
That's disappointing. They should follow their own policies, but okay, we'll get into that in a moment.
That's not the way the world works.
I keep hearing this, Tom, and slowly but surely it's sinking in. It sounds to me like he's the president of the world, and we think we're electing only the president of the United States. That's the perception I'm getting from our conversation. I want to get to the other issues of the events of the day, but first we've got a caller standing by. Let's go to Walter in Alliance. Walter, good evening. Yes, sir.
Tom, why are you under the misconception that Obama was a uniter?
I didn't say he was.
You implied it.
I didn't say that, Walter.
Wait, Walter. Hold on.
Trump is a divider and not a uniter.
I said, and I think if you just look at the protests, Walter, I mean, there were not millions of people protesting in the wake of the inauguration of Barack Obama, in neither inauguration. But there were.
And there's not too many conservatives who get thrown off planes for making comments against passengers. This is one-sided thing. I mean, I think that Europe and Britain, they're mad because they can't rely on the United States anymore.
You see this as a feeling that they cannot rely on the United States. I've got to go to a break, but let Tom respond to that. Tom, is that the perception that they can no longer rely on the United States?
Yes, that is the perception. And that is what's worrying because the United States, let me just stress, the United States needs Europe, it needs peace, it needs stability around the world. And it needs it for its own prosperity, not only for the prosperity of other countries.
I would agree with that.
And so if you withdraw that support, you run the risk of instability.
Okay, you've made your point. I've got to go to the break. But Walter, thank you very much for your call. That was an interesting and provocative question. Thanks for their time. Let's take a quick break here on Viewpoints Around the World with Tom Arms of Look Ahead Radio, heard every Friday afternoon here on the program, and radio stations around the country, I might add, make that around the world, as well as LookAheadNews.com. I'm going to suggest to you joining his newsletter by just simply logging on to LookAheadNews.com.
Look Ahead Radio will return in just a moment.
This is Tom Arms with LookAheadNews.com's expanded world analysis for the week beginning the 30th of January. Next week, President Donald J. Trump announces his nominee for the U.S. Supreme Court. He's expected to use the platform of the annual National Prayer Breakfast in Washington on Thursday. Abortion is at the top of the agenda for evangelical Christians, and Trump has promised an anti-abortion justice who will vote to overturn Roe v. Wade. Top candidates for the lifetime appointment are Neil Gorsuch, Thomas Hardiman, and William Pryor. Another big event will be the visit to the Oval Office on Tuesday of Mexican President Enrique Peña Nieto. The agenda includes the wall, NAFTA, deportation of illegal immigrants, and the flood of drugs from Mexico to America. On the topic of drugs, another Mexican, Joaquin El Chapo Guzman, is now the unwilling guest of the American government. On Friday, he appears in a Brooklyn court on charges of running the world's biggest drug trafficking ring. In another New York court on Tuesday, terror suspect Ahmed Khan Rahimi is on trial. Rahimi is accused of setting off a series of bombs in New York and New Jersey, in which 30 people were injured. On the other side of the Atlantic, the big news remains Brexit. Next week, the British Parliament debates the issue after the UK Supreme Court said parliamentary approval was needed before the formal start of negotiation.
Parliament is unlikely to block the Brexit negotiations, but it could delay their start beyond the 30 March deadline set by Theresa May. Brexit and Trump are on the agenda when the EU heads of government hold an informal summit in Malta next Friday. The EU leaders are particularly concerned about the prospect of a quick UK-US trade deal, and reports that the President is opposed to supranational organisations such as the EU, thinks Germany's role is too dominant, and believes that the euro will collapse within 18 months. Elsewhere in Europe, German Chancellor Angela Merkel is in Sweden on Tuesday and Wednesday for talks with her Swedish counterpart Stefan Löfven. Meanwhile, Russian President Vladimir Putin is in Hungary on Thursday for talks on upgrading the Russian-built Pax nuclear reactor, which supplies 40% of Hungary's electricity. It is Budget Day in India on Wednesday. Finance Minister Arun Jaitley will present an optimistic report and is expected to cut taxes. Not expected to be optimistic is the economic outlook from the Bank of Japan, published on Tuesday. Growth is only 1.1%, and the Japanese are unhappy about Trump's cancellation of the Trans-Pacific Partnership. And that was next week's News Today from LookAheadNews.com, so that you can plan to participate in the world around you. Stay tuned for Viewpoints Around the World with myself and Lockwood Phillips.
Welcome back to Look Ahead Radio. Here is Lockwood Phillips.
Viewpoints Around the World with Tom Arms. We have several callers standing by. We do have really a punch list of things we want to talk about. The elections in the Netherlands. We've got to talk about Brexit and the decision by the British Supreme Court. And then, of course, the issue we're touching on this, the Trump policy in Europe. We have several callers standing by. Tom, first, let's start with Jan in Beaufort. Jan, good evening. Welcome to Viewpoints Around the World.
Hi. I wanted to tell you how much I enjoy listening to Tom Arms every week, and I enjoy his accent, but I wanted to let him know that the reason people didn't go out and protest Barack Obama was because if we did, we were racist. But Donald Trump is a very white man, so it's okay to disagree with him.
That's a very interesting observation. Thank you very much, Jan. Appreciate that call. Let's go to Dennis in Jacksonville. Dennis, good evening. Yes, sir.
Well, I did want to point this out because I hear a lot of anger sometimes when Tom gets on, and this is a pretty conservative area, a pretty conservative radio station. But I wanted to ask Tom a question. If you were to look at the European countries that make up the Euro as a whole, what percentage of them would you say would be Democrat voters in the United States?
Oh, it's difficult to tell.
Yeah, that is.
Just roughly, if you were to guesstimate what percentage of them would vote for a Democrat versus Republican? I'm just
probably
curious.
60%. I'd say more than 50%.
More than 50?
Because they tend to be less conservative as a whole.
That's what I thought. That's why I was asking the question. And so the thing that I think that I'm hearing and that I'm listening to now, when I'm hearing people are kind of upset that Europe as a whole is upset at us, to me it's kind of simple if you're a Republican, and I am. It's that we have a country that's $20 trillion in debt. So I'm curious, if the European Union would like to kind of protest and have a say-so in our elections, are they willing to take on a third of our $20 trillion debt in order to help us out so that we can get back on track?
No, it doesn't work like that. I wish it did sometimes.
Wait a second.
I guess what I'd have to say is I think we need to leave it to the American people to vote in a manner that they feel will get this country back on track so that we're not operating to the point we've created a $20 trillion debt. We can't keep doing what we've been doing and expect different results. That's called insanity. And I think what you've seen in the United States is you've seen half the country wake up and realize we are $20 trillion in debt, and each year we are still adding to that at a significant pace.
All right.
I think that if we don't do it, I want to know what the solution is from Europe that's looking at us and saying, don't change anything, but we want you to keep staying in debt. I'm curious what the answer would be.
Okay, can I just pose back a question at you?
Sure.
Because it's quite clear if you study the policies of President Trump that he's going to be increasing the debt.
I disagree. I don't think it is.
He admits that he'll be increasing the debt, that he'll be borrowing money to pay for infrastructure. He wants to build more roads,
everything
more
I've heard
airports,
has to do
more ports,
if
and that's
going to
and a wall, and that's going to cost a lot of money.
Yes, it's going to cost a lot of money. One real quickly, Dennis, because I've got a question I want to ask, but you were going to say one quick thing. I want to move on. Go for it.
Well, what I want to say is that a lot of the predictions you hear are based on a static economy that creates no more tax income. What you have with Trump is somebody who's saying, look, Barack Obama for 8 years, we never reached 3% growth in our GDP. We never got there. It's the first time in the history of a presidency that you never got 3% growth. We were operating at 4 to 6 with Reagan, et cetera. Trump's policies are designed to pump up this economy, to create more taxes that can do the things we're talking about doing and pay for something like infrastructure. But right now, I think the simple answer for the people who voted is that we are $20 trillion in debt. We cannot keep doing what we've been doing and expect different results.
Dennis, thank you. All right, Dennis, thank you very much for your call. I appreciate it. I've got another caller standing by. I've got to get to that caller very quickly so we can move on to the next segment, Tom. But I have a quick question for you. Of course, the U.S. economy is concerned related, and Dennis brought this up, to the $20 trillion debt that we're facing. What about other countries in Europe, the UK? What is their financial status at this point? And I'm asking this in a broad question. You may not have the details, but are the economies...
I don't have the details. It varies from country to country. But, I mean, in the UK, I think it's not so much the size of the debt which counts. It is the size of the debt in relation to GDP. Uh-huh. In the case of the United States, I believe it's about 85%. In the case of the UK, it's about 90%. In the case of France, it's about 93%. In the case of Italy, it's 125%.
Wow. That is that.
In the case of Greece, it's even more. In the case of Germany, I think it's quite low down. I think it's below America's. It's not the size of the debt; it's the ability to pay the
off.
Debt.
All right, that's
the same that you could apply household economics to national debt.
No, I agree. That's just telling us that the whole issue of debt is a ticking time bomb. I've got about a minute and a half to go before we go to the break. I've got to get Ernie on. Ernie, thanks for your patience. Welcome. Yes, sir.
Thanks for listen, I'm not as erudite and as long-winded as your previous caller, but I'm thinking that the vote for a Democratic type of person over there would be about 90%. I do respect Great Britain for leaving the European Union. That was a good thing to do. They're nothing but a bunch of leeching socialists. And Tom has to understand that Trump is going to be Great Britain's best friend. Trust me, he's going to be Israel's best friend. He's going to be Great Britain's best friend. And this is extremely important. And the last comment I'll make is...
Okay, hold on, Tom.
I made the same comment a week ago. The majority of us, and I might say us, the kind of folks that voted for Trump, could care less what you Western Europeans think about what's going on here.
We bring up a very good point, and Ernie, thanks for your call. I appreciate that. Tom, as we go to the break...
reply?
Yes, please.
Okay. First of all, I like to think more in global terms because I think, a rising tide floats all ships. Uh-huh. And I really do think, in this small, shrinking, interconnected world, that's how you have to think. Not just what's good for Britain, not just what's good for America, but what's good for everyone, because we are all fused together. Yeah, it probably will be good for Britain, and I think we're going to come to that in a moment, because Theresa May is going to be arriving at the Oval Office on Friday.
Now, let's leave it at that for the moment. You answered the question I was going to ask you. How is this believed? What's the feeling in the United Kingdom about Ernie's comment that we will be the United Kingdom's best friend? We're going to get back to that in a moment here on Viewpoints Around the World with Tom Arms. Stay with us.
Look Ahead Radio will return in just a moment. We now return to Look Ahead Radio. Here is Lockwood Phillips.
Viewpoints Around the World with Tom Arms. I do have a caller standing by. Tom, of course, joining us from London, England. I do want to remind you about both his radio program, Look Ahead Radio, as well as lookaheadnews.com. And you can sign up to be participate in his news cycle by just going to that website, LookAheadNews.com. Tom, before I get to James in Midway Park, very quickly, I just want to make note of this. I looked it up on the web. The greatest debt relationship to national GDP, gross domestic product, Japan, 229%, Greece, 176%, Lebanon, 139%, and on down. And the United States, 104%, Spain, 99%, and for your interest, to the United Kingdom, 89%. United Kingdom is a better position than the United States, interestingly enough. All right, James in Midway Park. James, I'm going to ask you to be very quick so we can move on to other items, but welcome. Yes, sir.
Okay, one thing, the size of the debt also determines the ability to pay the debt.
Right.
And not only that, saying we were all fused together, we're all fused together. We are no longer sovereign nations. We're all one stinking one world nation.
Yeah, yes, we are one world. I wouldn't have used the word stinking, but let me just point out that if you want iron ore for your steel mill, you go to Canada or you go to Sweden.
Yep. You make
if you want phosphate to fertilize your crops, then you go to Morocco, and you have to be nice to them.
Yes, right.
It's just the way the world works, and it's not going to change.
All right, let's move on to Theresa May and the Supreme Court decision related to Brexit. Tell us what happened there, Tom.
Well, basically, the Supreme Court says that Parliament is supreme. Parliament is sovereign, not the Prime Minister. The Prime Minister is the representative of the Queen or the monarch. Appoints the Prime Minister, and the convention is the Prime Minister has to have the support of the majority in the House of Commons. But Parliament as a whole is supreme over the Prime Minister and thus over the monarch.
Well, here's the question for you, Tom. Could then Parliament decide to rescind the vote and instead not leave the EU?
It is highly unlikely.
Okay.
Because the Conservative Party, which is Theresa May's party, has a majority. Now, it's not a big majority. The majority is only 15. So far, only one Conservative has definitely said that they would vote against invoking Article 50, which is what is needed to start the negotiations rolling. The Liberal Democrats, the Scottish National Party, they have said they'd vote against it. Labour Party says that they will not prevent the invoking of Article 50, but they have said they might introduce amendments to it, amendments to the parliamentary bill needed to invoke it. And that could seriously delay the invoking of negotiations.
I'm going to move on to an issue associated with that very quickly because we've got another caller coming in. Tom, if it is delayed, what does that do to the United Kingdom's economy? Because decisions have to be made. And, of course, there is the concept of another election, is there not?
The next election is not due to be held until 2020. It depends on how long it will be delayed. Now, the markets obviously don't like uncertainty.
Right.
But Theresa May has fairly clearly stated exactly what she wants, which is she wants to be out of the single market and she wants to be out of the customs union. It's what's called a hard Brexit.
But the kicker here is things have to happen pretty quickly or the economy in Britain is going to suffer, is it not?
No, I don't think so.
Okay.
It's the uncertainty that makes it suffer more than anything else. But what could happen is that if it is not sorted out before 2020, well before 2020, is that it could become an election issue in the next election. And if that happens, then all bets are off.
Okay. Tom, let's talk very quickly about, I want to get to the issue of the Netherlands, and we've got to talk about China. But there was a Trident missile fired, and Parliament was not aware of the fact that the missile went off course. It was not armed. What is the issue on defense spending there in the UK?
Well, it's a big issue. As you know, that they're supposed to keep to 2%, and Britain is one of the few NATO countries, along with Greece and I think one of the Baltic states, who are spending 2%. But it was only about 30 years ago that it was spending 6% of its GDP. on defense. So it's gone right down. The Navy now is a fraction, a shadow of what it has been in the past. It's half the size of the Japanese Navy.
So what is to be done?
Well, it's going to be one of the discussion points when Theresa May meets with Trump on Friday.
Okay.
But also coming up, Theresa May will be raising the issue of Donald Trump's reports or comments about NATO being obsolete. She doesn't think that that is very constructive. She also, talking about the visit, she also is not in favor of his being so opposed to the European Union. Comments by people like Ted Malloch saying that Trump doesn't like supranational organizations and that he thinks that the EU is too dominated by Germany and that it's all going to collapse in 18 months. Theresa May will say are not at all constructive and not with British policy. They may not want to be part of Europe, but they don't want an unstable Europe 20 miles away on the other side of the English Channel. When that has happened in the past, it's resulted in world wars.
All right, let's move on to other items. We've got to get through this list of items, and there's an interesting story again, with Europe. You have an election in the Netherlands. Is the far right going to take power in that country?
It is neck and neck in the opinion polls with the Liberal Party in Netherlands. That does not mean that it will take power. I can't remember when any single party was able to form a majority government in the Netherlands. It's because they have a proportional representation system, and there's about a dozen different parties. And so it's very difficult for one party to form the government. All of the parties are opposed to Geert Wilders' Freedom Party. So even if it were to win the most number of seats, it's highly unlikely to win the majority number of seats, and all the other parties will probably form a coalition against the Freedom Party.
Okay, we're going to get back to other items. I've got to take a quick break. We have to talk about the influence of China, and there's a note here. The last remaining hero of globalism, which goes back to the comments made a few moments ago by James. We've also got other items I hope we can get to this evening here with Look Ahead Radio host Tom Arms, and also, of course, LookAheadNews.com is his blog. You're listening to Viewpoints Around the World.
Look Ahead Radio will return in just a moment.
Observations of an Expat by Tom Arms from LookAheadNews.com. The Anglo-American special relationship is becoming the extra special relationship, and not for the right reasons. The special relationship is based on a shared historic, legal, cultural and philosophical root, buttressed by military and political alliances, a shared outlook of the world, and intelligence services which are joined at the hip and just about every other part of the political anatomy. The extra special relationship is based on a shared pariah status, siege mentality, and Britain and America's common need for friends in an increasingly friendless world. The Brexit vote has isolated the UK from its former partners in continental Europe. Trump's style plus his anti-Islamic, anti-EU, anti-free trade, anti-NATO, anti-Chinese, and pro-Russian and pro-Israeli rhetoric has done the same. On top of that, Prime Minister Theresa May needs a big trade deal to show that Brexit can work to Britain's advantage. Trump is offering a massive bribe, the trade deal. But can such a deal be negotiated quickly? Is it really in Britain's interest? Is it in the interest of the wider world? Is it worth the price of cozying up to Trump? What impact would a Trump-May love affair have on British politics? Yes, the deal can be negotiated quickly. It has effectively already been completed. It is called the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership, or TTIP, which has been hammered out between the Obama administration and dumped by the Trump people. All that is required on the part of the British and American negotiators is to go through the documents and change EU to UK. That should take a lot less than the 90 days allotted by Ed Malik, Trump's ambassador designate to Brussels. Trump wants a weakened EU. A united Europe is a commercial competitor to the United States. He supports Brexit and the alt-right anti-EU populist movements sweeping across the continent because businessman Trump knows he can get better deals negotiating with a motley collection of national governments than he can with the world's largest trading bloc. But this is not good for Britain. The May government wants out of the European Union, but it does not want the European Union to fail. Britain has historically always been separate from but part of Europe. Instability on the European continent dragged it into 2 disastrous world wars in the 20th century, and scores of others in the centuries before that. There are other key areas of disagreement. Britain is a leading advocate for global free trade. It is pro-NATO, and like the rest of the alliance, worried about Trump's talk of obsolescence and closer political and military relations with Russia. Commercial, political, and military attacks on China are seen by Britain as dangerously counterproductive, and a pro-Israeli Islamophobic policy is viewed as yet another recruitment poster for Al-Qaeda and ISIS. Next, there's the impact that a close Trump-May relationship would have on British domestic politics. Theresa May's majority in the House of Commons is a slim 15 votes, and Trump is highly disliked on all sides of the House. Yes, America's status as the world's only superpower means that government ministers have to work with the Trump administration, but they should be wary of being seen to support Trump the man. He is heartily disliked in Britain. 100,000 protesters took to the streets of London the day after his inauguration. But more telling was a survey conducted by ComRes of the wider British public. 66% said that the world was in a more dangerous place as a result of the election of Donald Trump. 10% said it was safer. 58% thought Trump's election set a dangerous precedent for American and world politics. And 15% thought that it was good to shake things up a bit. British Prime Minister Harold Macmillan once famously said that Britain's role was to play Greece to America's Rome. The belief was that British wisdom would temper gung-ho America. Tony Blair's experience in Iraq underscored the dangers of that approach.
Welcome back to Look Ahead Radio. Here is Lockwood Phillips.
Viewpoints around the world with our guest host, Tom Arms of Look Ahead Radio and, of course, of LookAheadNews.com. Tom, we've got about 5 minutes to go and a lot to run through. Let's start with Xi Jinping and China. You note here the last remaining hero of globalism. How quickly can you respond to that? That's an interesting comment.
Well, they loved him in Davos. You know, he was the first Chinese president there, and he just spouted all the right things. Davos is a very globalist-oriented organization, the World Economic Forum, that is. He talked about China will keep its doors wide open. They will not close their doors. That no one will emerge as a winner in a trade war. The protectionism is like locking oneself in a dark room. Now, my theory is that he is positioning himself to take over from the United States as the hero of globalization.
Those are very fine words, come under the category of platitudes, but China is not an open economy.
It is not an open economy, but it is striving to become more open. I think would be Xi Jinping's argument.
That would be nice to see. It would be nice to see. I am cynical to a point of disbelief.
But what I'm trying to say is I do think that, you see, the TTP agreement is now dead in the water.
Right.
China is going to try and negotiate a successor to that agreement, but instead of the United States being the kingpin, it will be China.
Well,
and so the United States will be pushed out of Asia in terms of trade.
All right.
Because it will go now towards China. That's what it's aiming to do. It's trying to say, United States is going to put up your tariffs. United States or its tariffs. United States is going to be protectionist, but we aren't.
China has been, and China has always had tariffs, and they've made all sorts of requirements for any trade in China, including removing certain items from sales. This is interesting. I appreciate your observation. One has to say, here in the United States, absolute disbelief. But I'll tell you what, if it does in fact end up opening up China, that's good for the world. Let's talk about another item. Turkish president getting his way and extended powers. And this is a major story that's not getting a lot of play, Tom. What is the impact there in Turkey?
Oh, he's basically the parliament there has voted to allow him to hold a constitutional referendum with him dictatorial powers. The role of prime minister will be abolished. That the president will, from 2019, that's another 2 years from now, be able to stay in office for 2 consecutive 5-year terms, so he won't have to leave office till 2029. He can appoint all the cabinet posts and senior officials without reference to parliament, so there is no parliamentary scrutiny anymore. Effectively, he would become dictator. He could declare a state of emergency whenever he likes. There will be a referendum on this in March or April. 130,000 of his opponents have been locked up, most of them journalists, so there's not going to be much opposition. It will almost certainly sail through because it won't be a fair election. That's more or less it in a nutshell. How's that?
All right, let's talk about the issue of the return of jihadists to Tunisia.
Yeah, well, they're seriously worried. Basically, the jihadists are, starting to flee from places like Mosul and Raqqa and whatever in Syria and Iraq. 8,000 of them are believed to have come from Tunisia. The reason they came from Tunisia is because those who are Islamic fundamentalists are very much opposed to the establishment of Western democracies of the sort that was established in Tunisia in 2011 during its Arab Spring. And they equate democracy with anti-Islam.
Right.
And so, they get very annoyed by it. And
okay.
So they set off, at least 8,000 of them have gone off to Syria and Iraq, and now they're being pushed out and they're coming home.
Okay.
And so far, about 1,000 of them returned home. The government says they're arresting them all, but obviously some are going to slip through the net, and they're seriously worried that you can have some serious fighting in Tunisia in the next 6 months, year.
In essence, the conflicts that we've seen in Syria and Iraq and some of those areas will just simply be relocated to Tunisia. That's going to have a major impact on North Africa. Let's wrap it up here with your story about the Shanghai Rainbow Singers.
Yeah, I sent you a link to this. The reason I like this one is they're a big national choir in China. And they've got a hit song out, and it's all about Chinese New Year. And if you just took out the words Chinese New Year and inserted Thanksgiving or Christmas, you'd think it was America. It's all about someone coming home for Chinese New Year and all the relatives saying, "What are you doing about your job? Why don't you marry so-and-so? Why don't you do this? Why don't you do that?" And it's so beautifully done. And I think it demonstrates the common humanity. The Chinese have the same family problems as the people in Morehead City, North Carolina. I recommend listening to it. It's on YouTube. I sent you the link. I hope you can put it up on your Facebook page.
We will do that.
It's really quite amusing.
All right. Tom Arms, of course, of Look Ahead Radio, but also of Look Ahead News. And as always, to remind you, you can easily join him by simply going to the website and looking for the opportunities to find out about tomorrow's news today. And that's lookaheadnews.com. Tom, thank you for being with us this evening.
Thank you, Lockwood.
Viewpoints Around the World with Tom Arms.
Look Ahead Radio is a production of the Talk Station.